So I'm going to start pretty promptly because we have just about an hour to kind of give you a bunch of information. And then I always love a good half hour or so for you guys to ask me questions. So tonight we're going to cover a lot of stuff. And don't worry if I see some of you are here with notes, right? Like the moms in the crowd are taking those notes. But online too, you will get this video sent to you so you can rewatch it
and the
PowerPoint and all of those things. So don't feel like take time to just absorb tonight and then go back. And you can always reach out to me after for questions or to set up time to talk. So I'm going to get started. So tonight is all about executive functioning and ADHD and how they are so interconnected. And many kids, especially even adults in our society today, we have a very big increase in diagnosis of ADHD. Really started, there's always been cases of ADHD, but then there was kind of this mix of like, is it really ADHD or is it a form of dyslexia? Because there's all this processing pieces that go along with ADHD. So we're going to get into lots of different pieces of that tonight and how executive functioning and ADHD are together and how there will be deficits throughout life with executive functioning, and they come at different stages throughout development. And if they're for all the adults, we all have times where our executive functioning skills are really low, right? In different areas, whether we've had enough sleep, enough to eat, or our life is just crazy and we're managing 100 different things. So make sure if you have any questions, you let me know.
Erin's having a hard time hearing. So the microphone is right in front of you.
Okay.
Okay, just depending on where you are, so if you start wandering.
Okay, thank you, Erin, for letting me know that. Okay, so the agenda kind of talked about the introduction of what the symptoms are of ADHD. We're going to talk also about understanding what executive functioning is. There's 12 areas of executive functioning. How we practice at WHILDE, the WHILDE formula, like how it works. I know I have a couple friends in my room right now that actually come to our practice, so I'll get to explain a lot of like what happens here. And then we're going to talk about emotional regulation because that's a big piece for especially kids with ADHD and just ADD, right? There's two different components. Sometimes in the DSM right now, we just stick with ADHD, but not everybody has that hyperactive component. They just have the inattention piece. We're going to talk about nutrition and exercise and sleep, and then how to build resiliency and self-advocacy. So there's actually a lot of good things about people that have ADHD. So I want you guys to think about your kids having this as a superpower, not as a negative thing, even though I know it's hard to parent sometimes like that. Okay, a little bit about myself. I'm a mom. I have 4 children. I have two of them that have autism and one that has dyslexia. And then our oldest, she's 26 now, so she's figuring out her world path. I founded the WHILDE School as well as the WHILDE Method in our private practice, and we serve kids throughout Maine as well as in other states, online and in person, helping with neurodiversity and just parent and self-support because our world definitely needs more of that. I am currently finishing my doctorate program in educational leadership, focusing on autism specifically and neurodiversity. I've spent a lot of time working with kids with ADHD and executive functioning, and the program that we have here today at WHILDE, we built specifically because my middle daughter, who was first diagnosed with autism, struggled immensely with organization, executive functioning skills. And executive functioning was not a hot word until about 6 or 7 years ago. And I want to ask you guys, why do you think the executive functioning is such a big hot word now? Because when we were, I know I'm not that old, I'll be 41 here next week, a couple weeks actually, and executive functioning wasn't something that was ever a word when we were younger. Why do you guys think? Anyone online can raise their hand too. Why do you think?
Technology.
Technology is one of them, right? We used to have to remember our telephone numbers, right? If your friend you were gonna make a hangout or something, you had to write on a piece of paper, right, and hand it, or right, or you had to remember directions because there wasn't a GPS or Google Maps, right? So we had to use our brains in many different ways. We had to look things up in a dictionary. We had to, learn how to do cursive, right, and different things that our brains used back, before technology came into place, as well as convenience. Everything is made to make our lives easier, right? And our executive functioning skills get weaker when we try to make our environment easier for ourselves. Okay, so an overview of ADHD. I'm sure many of you know what this is, considering you're here tonight, so you probably have a child or yourself. So it is attention deficit for hyperactivity disorder. And like I said, some kids don't have that hyperactive piece, they have the inattention piece. And then some have both. And that's where you get the ADHD. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's characterized by patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. That impulsivity is something we're going to talk a lot about tonight because that's usually one of the hardest pieces of development when kids are in that younger age, and even when they get into like those higher level ages when their frontal lobe is doing all kinds of crazy things and they're teenagers and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, let's make some good choices, right? And then the effects that it has on educational outcomes, social interactions, and self-esteem, because that's a big piece of what makes ADHD very challenging, especially for kids that are developing. Okay, so I'm also somebody that likes to be strength-based too. So they have amazing brains with somebody that has ADHD. Many of them are entrepreneurs. They think outside the box. They're incredible at problem-solving skills. And then the importance of support for families and schools. Parents they're the ones that are leading the path, right? Like you guys are here to support your kids. And this is new, right? If you personally don't, as a parent, have ADHD and you have a child with one, you're learning right along with them, right? And also you as parents and educators, there's always things that are changing and tools that you can use, devices, all kinds of things. And so really making sure that your community that your child is involved in has those educated people to help support you as parents, and also for you guys to help support and advocate for them in school environments. And then treatment options. We won't get into too much of this treatment option. I'm going to just brush over it quickly right now. There are many different types of treatment options. So if you are somebody that your child really needs medication, there are times where medication is important. What has been seen over studies and long periods of time is that those medications suppress their creativity, suppresses their appetite, suppresses their abilities to think outside the box, to have those problem-solving skills. But that medication is to help manage behavior, right? It's not to help manage the creativity piece and who they are as a person. Sometimes as they develop and they get into high school, they tap out of that medication. So really a strategic treatment plan is if you decide to go that medication route, that you're also developing skills to support that as well. And then there are other types of treatment options with food, supplements, as well as supporting those lasting skills. Also sensory diet. I'm not sure if anyone here knows about sensory diets, but sensory diet is not a diet that you eat. It's more of like the sensory stimulation within their environment that they need and that they're seeking in order to support themselves. Okay, so ADHD symptoms. So real-time forgetfulness. It's not, you could probably tell your child 100 times, could you please remember your sneakers for PE, right? Or did you forget that your homework was in your bag? Or, right? There's so many things, right? And you're like, for the love of Pete, I've asked you this 100 times. How do you forget, right? It's not intentional. I promise you it's not intentional. Their brain just can't. We have hyper focus or hyper lows. And so a hyper focus is they are fixated on something, right? And so that's that piece that sometimes goes misdiagnosed because people are like, well, they can focus on Minecraft for like 5 hours, right? But giving them a book to read, they can't focus, right? Because that's that preferred task, right? If you have a preferred task or something that you're interested in, they can hyper focus in on that. What's the sad part is that hyper low focus. It means that they really can't focus for an extended period of time on things that are challenging. And most of the time, that is a communication type of low, meaning reading, writing, or social communication. And that's because of the area of the brain that it affects. Is a lot of that verbal communication. It's the same area of the brain that dyslexia affects. So a lot of times there's this mixed path between dyslexia and ADHD. And sometimes kids will get diagnosed with ADHD, but in fact they have dyslexia because it's a communication barrier. World-class daydreaming. I love my kiddos. So a lot of kids that come to this school, the parents will ask me, can I take them off their meds? And I'm like, yeah, like yes, please. Because a lot of times they'll be sitting in there and they're like, oh, look at those stars up there, right? Like, and you're like, hey buddy, I'm kind of talking to you about something right now, right? And that's because their brain literally just misfires and checks out, right? It can be very frustrating, but at the same time, that's their way to re-regulate their brain, right? So, just keep in mind that when they are daydreaming, give them a moment. It's almost like I like to think of it as like your brain is taking a quick siesta so it can recharge in order for you to come back and be prompt. Procrastination, we're going to talk more about that when we get into executive functioning skills. Trouble with friendships, that really plays in when they're in the younger age with that impulsivity and being able to communicate. I want this. They want it. They don't know how to say, hey, could we share that toy, right? Or the impulsivity in class of like blurting out, right? Or being, moving in their seat all the time because they just can't. That impulsivity. Repetitive movements. This is the other piece that's a lot of kids will get diagnosed of being on the spectrum because of these repetitive movements. Nope, it's because their body needs to move constantly. It's a sensation, part of their nervous system. They cannot control that, and it is not autism. Now, I'm not saying that there are not kids that have autism that have ADHD, but a clear just ADHD does not fit for an autism diagnosis. And sensory seeking and aversions. That's because when you have ADHD, your sensory nervous system is just moving at 100 miles an hour, right? And so sometimes they need those deep compressions. They need to go out and be in the fresh air. They might need to scooter. So how we support that in an educational setting is we have different seats that they can sit in. They can scooter up and down the aisles if they need to. They have standing desks. They have breaks put in, right? Not breaks that they have to like leave the class and go do their work, but motor breaks, right? So they can come back and be present and be able to work together. Any questions so far? I don't want to move too fast. Okay. So I first want to ask my friends online and then in here, what do you think executive functioning is? Because we're here to talk about how it relates to ADHD. So what do you think it means? You didn't think I was just going to come and sit here and chat the whole time, right? You didn't know you were going to have to participate. So anyone online, what do you guys think executive functioning means?
during the day.
Life skills, functions we use during the day. Life skills in how?
Organization.
Organization, yep. That's the first one that most people think of. Ability to organize and get things done. Absolutely. Thank you, Renee, for putting that out there. So there's actually 12 different areas of executive functioning. And not everyone is strong in all of them, okay? And there are age ranges of where your kids should be and where our expectations of them should be, right? And sometimes they don't match. So I'm hoping tonight one thing that you take away is kind of thinking about what your expectation is and what they can actually perform. Because then you're not going to be in a constant battle, because you'll have more understanding of, okay, this is age appropriate right now. And if they're not at that age appropriate level, okay, now these are the skills we have to work on. All right, so there are 12 areas. I'm going to go through all 12. All right, so please stop me. I am going to ask you some questions along the way. So response inhibition, working memory, emotional control, task initiation, sustained attention, planning and prioritizing, organization, time management, flexibility, metacognition, goal-directed, and stress tolerance. Now, if you have any teenagers online or in this room, there is a new type of ADHD that is being diagnosed, and it's called acquired ADHD. And that goes to that technology piece. Everything in our environment is 4 seconds, right? You scroll on your Instagram or your Facebook or your TikTok. I don't do TikTok, but I hear from my teenagers, oh, I learned that on TikTok. Great. How long was the video? About 4 seconds. Yeah. Okay. So their attention span is literally 4 seconds. So if you think about you're going to go on this long talk to your kids, they're not listening to you. You got to cut it down, right? So this is this acquired ADHD. It's from computers, it's from cell phones, it's from gaming, it's from all of that social media that's constantly flooding into our face. And as parents, we're on our phones too, right? Like, it's the way of the world. We can't help it. And I can guarantee you, if you think about how much time you spend on social media, how many of you just read the headlines, or you skim, right? Or you're like, oh, that's too many words. Nope, I'll look at it later, right? Or you flag your emails later because there's too many words. That'd be me. So there's lots of time now that adults, as well as teenagers that didn't have any symptoms before, are having ADHD symptoms now. Okay, so response inhibition. So being able to think before you act, okay? That is very, very hard. That goes into that impulsivity, right? So younger ages, that goes along with blurting or jumping to a conclusion or being very adamant that, like, no, that was mine first, right? Or responding when they think something happened to them, but maybe it didn't, right? Or even when you're talking as parents to your son, right? Your son or daughter might respond in a certain way, even though that's not how you meant to come across. And that goes back to that communication. ADHD has a blood flow in the brain that causes inflammation. And with that inflammation, it suppresses the ability for the brain to use the nerves and neural pathways it needs to create that communication. It is a delay. That's why many kids that have ADHD also struggle with reading and writing, because it's that communication, right? They can't verbalize to you. And so that response is something that you work a lot on as with parents. Just want to make sure. Okay, working memory, using information held in the memory to complete tasks. This is tricky. So this goes back to that, like, I remember my daughter Kelsey, she would get off the school bus and talk about disheveled. Her stuff would be falling out of her backpack all the time, right? And I'd be like, so, do you have homework tonight? Well, I don't know. Well, I knew her teacher gave her homework right at the end of the day and put it in her folder, right? Like, we had a system. Well, what are you supposed to do? I don't know, right? And even though she had probably just had that lesson at the end of the day and been told what she needs to do, it's almost like poof, it's gone, right? And that working memory, we think of being able to like apply knowledge, right? So they also, it works in another way. You're being taught all day something, right? You go home and you're supposed to have a really good night's sleep. And some of our kids that have ADHD, they can't calm their brain enough to get into those deep sleeps. So they don't recharge and then be able to use their working memory to apply it later. That's why sometimes there's usually a delay in learning in math, English, math, not so much because they're very black and white thinkers. But when they get into the bigger math, they want to make shortcuts and don't want to work all of the problems down. So then what happens is they can't figure out, oh, why does that algebra concept not work anymore? Right? So they skip steps on how to actually apply what they've learned. Okay, emotional control. Are little people and big people that have ADHD massively empathetic. They feel so deeply, but because of that response inhibition, you don't always get to see that pureness inside. They feel so deeply for the people around them, but because of their inability, sometimes those things are missed. I can't stress that enough, that working on how to control those emotions will make it easier for them to control that emotion. So those are response inhibitions. The more you can control that and teach them those skills, the easier this emotional regulation will be easier for them. I will tell you that it's not something as a parent you should do alone, because then you're that person that they're always going to get upset with, right? You're there to be that supportive person, but having somebody to come and support you as the middle person, as that mediator, is very helpful, because then you can go back and be like, okay, do you see these strategies and these strategies? And you can be that person to comfort versus being that enforcer all the time. Task initiation, completing tasks. They start all kinds of tasks, right? I look at my house sometimes and I see projects in all these different places, not completed, right? But getting them to be able to complete tasks. They have the best intentions of completing the task, but then it gets to the place of like, well, what do I do next? I knew I needed to do this part, but I'm not really sure now, so I'm going to skip and go do something else, right? So getting them to be able to do a task that's not preferred to and complete it, like chores at home, right? Breaking things down into smaller chunks really helps with that. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm talking. Anyone online have any questions about any of this so far? Okay. Anyone in the room? No? Okay. Sustained attention, that's just part of their beautiful brains. They're absorbing everything around them all the time. They see things that we don't see. And we can look at it as a negative, or we could really look at it as a positive, right? And I tend to look at it as a positive. So the times that your child can't be focused means that something in their environment is making them distracted too, right? So having something that's grounding. Your mouth holds 80% of your sensory receptors, right? So you'll see a lot of kids that have struggles with this. They're either chewing on pens, they might have all kinds of things in their mouth, right? And you're like, what? Okay, why do you need to chew that right now, right? Like, we thought we got out of this oral fixation stage, right, when they're babies, right? But no, that's where all your receptors are. 80% of them. Makes sense, right? So food, make sure that they can snack. The more things that they can ground their body with. I'm a big fan of gum and lollipops for kids. If you are a no sugar person, totally get it, but they make gum that doesn't have sugar, and they have lollipops that are all natural. And having something to suck on or to chew, it helps their brain focus on their mouth, and then they're able to focus on what they need to. So thinking of different grounding things, putting rocks or sensory stuff in their pockets, right? Anything that just grounds their body. to the extreme. You could put, they have like those heavy vests sometimes or heavy blankets. One of our kids has a weighted blanket, but it's a hand thing, so she just holds it. Anything that they can put in their hands, okay? Planning and prioritizing. This goes to more of those older kids, not so much the younger from like, if you think I'm saying younger from like 3 to 8, right? You're not really doing a lot of planning and prioritizing. That's usually the parent. Where it does come into play is when they're in school and they have to start to plan a story and they have to start to break that down. Planning and prioritizing, that sequencing is very hard for them because their brain doesn't work that way. So putting things into place like visual cues. I'm huge with drawing first. Let them draw. They're very creative. If they have difficulties with fine motor, then you can use, there's a ton of online apps that create storyboards for them. By giving them a visual of, okay, you're going to do this first, then this, and then that. And sometimes it's a very daunting process. It could take a long time for them to finish something, but when they do complete it, they're so proud of themselves, right? I love watching my kids that struggle with ADHD complete a writing assignment, right? My class in the back, I have high school kids. Sometimes it takes them 2 months to complete something, but when they're done, they've worked hard at it, and you can see how empowering that can be for them. Planning and prioritizing also is a skill that when you get into learning how to be an adult and needing to be on time for things, planning your appointments, those are those life skills that we try to teach our teenagers as they're getting older, and those are important. Organization. So that's the one thing that I think all of us thought, like when I said executive functioning, organization was the first thing that came to your mind, right? Organization is individualized. What might work for you will not probably work for your kid, okay? So the more you try to use your method with them, it's going to probably backfire on you. So try to figure out how they see the world. What is their learning style? How do they process in the world, right? So I kind of look at my family. I'll give you examples. Like, so for me, I need to handwrite things. So I know that I have a family calendar that I have to live by. That's a Google Calendar, and I bet everybody in this room probably uses some type of Google Calendar, right? Or online calendar. And then I have my own that I have to use because that's my way of staying organized. I also can't have papers everywhere. So I have a clipboard. All my important papers sit on a clipboard. That's my organizational style. My middle daughter, who I built my executive functioning program around, she needs to color code everything. That color for me, my dyslexic brain, I'm like, whoo, too many colors. No, thank you, right? But that works for her. And so you need to find your own. Our teenagers, if you have teenagers online, I don't see too many faces, but they are all online kids, right? Everything needs to be on their phone. So there's a ton of apps out there that help with organization and can sync into their Google Classrooms, can sync to any type of other program that they have within their school system. It's very helpful and helps them set reminders. Time management. Time management is a tricky one because we manage our kids' time up until a certain age, right? We say what time they need to go to school, when their practices are. So all of a sudden we expect them to know how to manage time. If we don't teach them as parents on how to manage their time, and then all of a sudden they're expected to do that, it's a skill they haven't learned, right? And in past years, like in past history, we set up our own, like, hey, Johnny, you want to go play at the tree at a certain time, right? Like, our parents weren't setting up those play dates, right? You were outside, the whole neighborhood was around, right? If you needed to get to work, you either rode your bike or, right, there was another form. In today's society, as parents, we plan everything. So by the time they get to teenagers, they need to start to plan their homework, right? They need to start to plan when their practices are because you're not transporting them all the time. They want to go and do X, Y, and Z. They need to plan accordingly. So this time management piece, right, is such an abstract thought process for many of them. And now throw in your disorganizing, right, ways of thinking and, oh my word, I'm going to be late for this. Or some kids get so anxious about time that they don't want to even think about it. So this whole piece around time management is a tricky one with executive functioning. I'm somebody that needs to be 5 minutes early to everything, while my husband can be fashionably late and I'm anxious, right? So everybody has a different concept of time. I see some looks in the thing. Sorry for any husbands in here. Flexibility. Flexibility is hard. I want to give you some encouragement of saying that it gets easier as they get older. What's hard with flexibility is that they have this rigid thinking, and it really relates to anxiety. That inflexibility, kids with ADHD have a high rate of anxiety. And because of that, when we stress to them, you have to do this, and it's not something that feels natural to them, it becomes really hard. Or they resist on, I'm not doing that writing project, or I'm not doing this, because it doesn't come natural to them. It makes them feel insecure about themselves. And that anxiety is really where that inflexibility comes. So how to work around that is really setting some boundaries and coming to a compromise sometimes, to a point where sometimes you do need to push, but then sometimes you need to just let go. And kind of figure out that path together. This is an area that I do a lot of parent support on, because it's not easy, especially if you have more than one kid in your household, because your other kids see everything that goes around, right? We have 4 kids, we feel like we parent the same, but obviously each kid is different, so you can't parent each kid the same. They all need different things. But flexibility is something that is very, very tricky with our kiddos that have ADHD many times. Metacognition, that's a skill that most kids do not develop until they're somewhere in their 20s, because their brains aren't fully developed. So it's kind of like standing back and looking at things from a bird's eye view. Where this plays in is like when they're with their friends, right? And something happens. Can they sit back and be like, oh, this was my part in the situation? Or, no, I didn't do this, and I can reflect on how I wasn't part of this. Or sitting back on an assignment and say, I could have done this differently, and maybe I should have asked for some help with this. Or just saying, like, I was really proud of myself for this, right? Being able to reflect. And this is something that a lot of kids can't do until they're in their late teens, early 20s. So don't stress. I always say when parents come in, they do the executive functioning assessment for kids, and the metacognition is in growth opportunity. I'm like, well, that's because they're not there yet. All right. Goal directed. If your kids don't have goals for themselves, and that can be something so teeny tiny, right? Like, I want to tie my shoes, or I want to learn how to ride a bike. It does not have to be an academic goal. When I don't see kids have goals for themselves, it makes me sad, because then it means they're not thinking about their future. They're not thinking about things that they want to try, right? Or become better at. And as humans, we're always growing and we're always changing, and we should always be reflecting. So when I have a kid that comes in and doesn't have any goals for themselves, I do a lot of digging and say, okay, well, what's something you want to try? Is there a place you want to go? How would you get there, right? With my older students, we do a lot of goal work, and setting SMART goals each week for my older kids, because that really matters when they get out into the real world, right? And knowing, like, even if you have struggles with ADHD, these are the types of brains that are going to make a difference in our world, right? They're the ones that are going to help our economy. They're the ones that are going to be doing some problem solving that in 2024 we really need, right? So don't think of goal directed as how to not be distracted. Think about it as how can they feel good and empowered by themselves, because they struggle, and there's a lot of struggling that happens, especially in the younger years. Stress tolerance. Many of them have high rates of stress tolerance, that anxiety. I'm sure some of you have heard, my belly hurts, I don't want to go to school, my head hurts. Or they hold it in all day, and then they get into the car and they are a stinking hot mess, and you're like, oh my word, what has possessed your body, right? Like, this is not okay. And that's because in their environment, they're working so incredibly hard to do all the expectations that everybody has for them and around them, even their peers. So really checking in with your child every day about this stress. And you don't have to make it as like, so how are you feeling today, right? It could be like, hey, what's the weather happening inside you today? All right, like, or doing a family check-in at dinner. Or in our house, we have a 45-minute ride one way, so I get my kids for an hour and a half every day. I'm like, so how's school going? Or how's so and so? They're all dating now, right? So you gotta dig sometimes, especially if your kiddo isn't a talker, right? So ways to find the stress is they're going to relate it to a bellyache, they're going to relate it to a headache, they're going to be really tired, or they're just going to be really impulsive or aggressive. And those are the times where you really need to check in and figure out what's going on. Why are they stressed? Okay, so I have about 20 minutes before I get to ask you guys. You get to ask me a bunch of questions, so I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. So I'm not going to read all of these. You guys will get this slide, but this is just a checklist. So ages 5 to 12, right? Really make sure if you have a kid in this age group that you look at this when it gets sent over to you, because this goes back to those expectations. I always see our expectations are not always clear, right? And for children that are already struggling with language, if your expectation of them is not clear, but also understanding what their level of abilities are, you're going to create a very hard environment for yourself and for your child. And then for teenagers and adults, this is the next step up. And not always do kids with ADHD struggle with every single one of these executive functioning. There's usually probably about like 5 or 6, right? And then they ebb and flow. When puberty hits for boys, you're going to be like, oh my God, we just worked on all of these skills and now they're out the window. What the heck happened? That testosterone goes right through the roof, and those executive functioning skills are like, you talk about daydreaming, you're like, ooh, anyone home in there? Right? And then if they are on medication, they tend to tap out, usually their freshman or sophomore year because of that level of testosterone. Not so much with girls. Okay, so challenges that face. I think you all can probably tell me the challenges that you guys have. So I'm going to take a minute to stop talking and read. Tell me some of the challenges you guys have at home, online, in here. Impulsivity, absolutely. Anyone online? What are some challenges that you guys have at home? Emotional regulation, that's a really big one. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Any others?
All the things on the list.
Yeah. Cleaning up when done. Yes, cleaning up after themselves. Boy, is that a challenge in my house. As a teacher, resistance to starting a task, that is so challenging for me too. You were going to say all of the above too, Kristen. Thank you. As a teacher, if I have some teachers in this room, the task initiation is really hard, especially when you have a classroom full of students and then you give the lesson and they're kind of start to go off and supposed to be active in starting that lesson. Then you have to come in and doing the supporting stuff. One of the things I have found really helpful with that is visuals, like first step, just do this. And then having them verbatim say it back to you. So now what are you supposed to do? Tell me in your own words, what is the expectation? Sometimes that's pretty helpful. Losing things, oh boy, right? Like I can't begin to tell you how many times my daughter loses things, our youngest. Task initiation and being goal directed, that is hard because a lot of them at certain times, they feel hopeless. They're like, I can't do this. My brain isn't working. I know I need to. And so they lose momentum and they lose focus and they lose the empowerment. Because how many of you have had teachers or your own family members or yourself be like, oh my word, what's wrong with my child, right? And people might make comments. You go to parent teacher conferences and they're like, wow, you have such a great child, but here are some of those things that he really needs to work on that's challenging, right? You leave as a parent or even as a teacher. I'm a teacher and I have a child that has ADHD, but I also know what it feels like to have to relay that information, right? And so when you think about thinking about that task initiation and being goal directed, it can be hard for them, right? Like, and for parents, like, tell me something good, right? Tell me something that's empowering myself so I can keep going, right? And that I can also say to my kids, like, you got this, buddy, right? Versus always having to work so hard. I teach an executive functioning class for 7th and 8th graders 6 times a day for 40 minutes of class. So really all of these 10 kids and 6 classes. Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. I think that when we look at executive functioning, opening it up and really understanding like how the emotions, the stress, the way they process information all goes into play on how they can organize their world. Thank you guys so much for sharing that stuff. Okay, so we talked all about executive functioning, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how our program runs and why we developed the program that we have. So we look at a formula, and I'm not a math brain, so we made a math formula for the people that are math brain, and then the words for the people that are wordy like me. So the WHILDE method is a formula that integrates academic learning and students' well-being, and it's influenced by 6 core attributes. So I look at behavior not as a bad thing, but as a good thing. What's the child's interest? That's your ticket. If you want them engaged, that's your ticket. Aspirations, so what's their goals, right? Can't tell you how many kids I have with ADHD that I give them a project in Minecraft. Man, is that my ticket? That's my carrot right there, right? But also looking at exercise, nutrition, and kind of did it backwards, sorry. Behavior, aspirations, interests, nutrition. So I can't stress enough that nutrition plays a humongous role in ADHD to help with behavior, help with sleep, help with emotional regulation. And I can go a little bit more into that if we have time at the end. Exercise, their bodies need to move, right? And there's a balance between over exercising and being exhausted to finding that balance of what they need. And then there's some kids that have ADHD that are not athletes, right? So how do you get that movement and that need out of their bodies? And then sleep. Sleep regulation for kids with ADHD is all over the place. They're either really great sleepers, right? They just totally crash out at the end of the day because they've gone 100 miles a minute, or they fall asleep hard, but then they don't stay asleep at night. Or some of them have intermediate. They can't fall asleep, and then they fall asleep, and then they wake up again, right? And so getting that deep REM sleep is sometimes really challenging. So we look at all of those areas, right? Because we need to eat, right? We need to exercise. We need to sleep. We need to be able to figure out in our world, like, why are we acting the way we are? I don't know about you, but I can get pretty hangry if I can't eat, right? And so some of my kiddos might not be able to verbalize that to me, but they might be super impulsive when they get out of school, right? Okay, well, did you eat anything? When's the last time you had something to eat, right? And so I have parents that come to school here that actually bring food for the moment their kids get in the car, because that way they're not having those outbursts when they get out. It's a soothing thing. Okay, so here's just a visual: behavior, aspirations, all the ones I said. I'd like to talk a minute about behavior because that's something that a lot of people relate to ADHD. Behavior is not a bad thing. Behavior is just communication, right? So when I assess somebody that comes in to look at this type of stuff, the executive functioning, and using this method, I look as like, how are your transitions? How many transitions do you have within your day, right? And are they tricky? How's your friendships, right? How do you communicate with your peers? How's your level of stress at school or at work or whoever I'm looking at, right? And then how do you eat? Are you a grazer? Are you a big eater? Do you not eat well, right? Because then that's going to affect your focus, right? For kids that can't focus, a lot of times it's their belly's hungry. Maybe they've had too much sugar. Maybe they haven't had enough protein. Have they been drinking water or other fluids? So we really look at that nutritional piece. And I'm a huge supplement. I went to school to learn about those things specifically for ADHD and autism. And there's a lot of supplements that can help with just regulating that nervous system. Okay, so how does this support my special people? Personalized learning approach, it is very important to look at what is their interest, okay? Now, I'm a big believer is you don't get what you want, you get what you need, right? And in school, it's very hard to make individualized plans, right? We try our best, but in a classroom you have maybe 17 to 22 kids, right? In this school, we don't. We have smaller groups, and that way we can do that individualized learning because it doesn't always work for everybody, right? It's not a one size fits all. So making sure like, okay, Johnny needs to work 5 minutes and then he needs a 30-second jumping jack break. Now he's going to go back, right? What is that individualized plan? A holistic development focus, looking at how's his body working, right? If you didn't sleep the night before and now you need to come in and your head's on the desk, you're not going to focus, right? This daylight savings. Whew, I have this one little guy this week. Every time I look over, he's like half asleep on his desk. And I'm like, oh, buddy, let me put a little blanket on you, take a siesta, and then you can come back to math class because then you'll be ready, right? But we don't have that ability always, right? Especially for my amazing teachers that are online or my public school people, like you don't have that ability, right? But there are ways to make those individual schedules and how do I want to say it, like accommodations in a classroom. So incorporate Bain's attributes. So really looking at those 6 attributes. Structure yet flexible learning. You need to have some flexibility, right? They might be incredibly interested in robotics, right? But have no interest in reading a chapter book that's for class, right? Okay, so you want to learn about robotics? Now you're going to have to read the manual on how to do that, right? So there's ways that you can integrate some of those skills that they need. Emphasis on executive functioning skills. If you have a child that has ADHD, they do have deficits in executive functioning. It is just the way their brain is developed. And yes, they will have struggles at different periods of time, but once they learn learn strategies on how to support themselves, these are lifelong skills. Okay, support and coaching, community and peer support. I just have a humongous heart for my parents, my school teachers, my social workers, because it takes a village. And some days as parents, you're completely burnt out and you just want to be like, oh my God, how do I make this better, right? Because you love your babies, right? You never want your kids to hurt, and you always want the best for them. And sometimes everything you might have tried is just not working, and you're like, okay, right? And same with your teachers, right? When you become a teacher, most teachers, I mean, there's rare few ones, but you love children and you want to help them, right? And so my lady out there that has that whole class with her executive functioning, like, can't stress enough of like how much beautiful work you're doing, because we need a lot of people to support the village. And then engagement with parents and caregivers. As parents, you need to advocate for your kids. You're the ones that are going to teach them how to advocate for themselves, as well as teachers will help your kids learn how to advocate for themselves too. But advocate, they need you. And even though it might be tired and daunting, the only way they're going to get the support that they need is from you guys advocating of like, this is what's working at home. Can you try this in the classroom, right? Or can you try this when you're out at a play group, or whatever the situation or environment is. Okay, emotional regulation, coping strategies. So connecting between the executive function and the ADHD, there are coping strategies. And some of that is looking at giving them language to describe how their body's feeling. They don't typically always have the language to tell you why I'm upset. Or they get incredibly upset and then they feel really bad after, right? It's one or the other. And so working with somebody that can help give you the language and the tools, there's a lot of systems out there that can help with emotional regulation. And it's not a pill, okay? So don't think that just because your child is on ADHD med that emotional regulation is going to be like amazing, right? There are strategies that you need to have in place for them to help work on that. And it does take time. Most of the people that I see for support are about emotional regulation and response inhibition and stress tolerance. Those are my three that I see most. Techniques for fostering intelligence and resilience in students is one of the things you guys can do at home too is story mapping. And what that means is like, okay, do you remember when we had this situation? Okay, how do you think we could have handled that differently, right? And what as a parent did I contribute to your emotional regulation, right? Because you're trying to express something to me and I'm not understanding it, right? Or your friend isn't understanding what you're experiencing side, because there's something that hits that red button that creates that emotional dysregulation, and trying to figure out what are those trigger points. Why is that happening? And it's very hard in the moment, right? When your child is a meltdown in public and you're now having all these people look at you, right? It's embarrassing. You wonder what people are saying, right? And all you can do is be like either frustrated, raise your voice, or be able to console them. But still, it doesn't feel good for you as a parent. It doesn't feel good for them either, right? So what is that trigger point? Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Because I kind of gave you a little bit of information, stuff on that one. We do have a few minutes for questions in a minute. Nutrition and exercise. So the impact of diet on ADHD symptoms. So an anti-inflammatory diet is incredibly helpful. Now, most of our kiddos that are ADHD or on the spectrum crave carbs. They want those crunchy carb foods. Now, it is not easy to be on a gluten-free diet. Trust me, I need to be on one, and it's not easy. Finding a good gluten-free bread or good gluten-free pasta, not as easy as it's getting better, much better. But an anti-inflammatory diet is very helpful. Also, limiting dairy, because all dairy and gluten are inflammatory foods, and they make the body work harder to process, as well as make them have brain fog. There's a lot of science out there on this, so I encourage you to do your research, because there's a ton of information on anti-inflammatory diets for children that have ADHD. Limiting sugar too, because their bodies are already racy, And if you can limit like how much processed food and how much sugar you're giving your child, that's important too. And increasing their water. Their bodies inside internally, whether they're physically moving or not, their nervous system is at a heightened speed. And so the more water you give them, the easier it is for them to focus too. You don't want to overhydrate, but you want to make sure that they're drinking, because sometimes they forget to actually hydrate and eat because they're absent-minded, right? They're in that beautiful creative world that they're in. Physical activity always increases those endorphins. It makes them feel good. School typically makes them feel negative about themselves. Finding an outlet that makes them feel good about themselves is important. So they might be an amazing athlete. That's going to increase their mood, right? They might be really good at science and robotics. Get them out doing that. They might like to go walk the dog and be with you in the woods, whatever. Find a way to find something physical that they can move their body, but also feel really good about. Yeah.
I have a question that came in over here. What if the child is extremely picky eater?
Oh, love, I totally hear you on that. Picky eater. So I had a client one time that literally ate only 4 foods, and really trying different textures, as well as looking at what are those preferred foods that they like. Are they a crunchy or are they a soft? And really focusing in on, okay, if it's a soft, let's try some other soft foods that might work, right? And slowly introduce something new every week. Don't introduce a whole bunch of things at one time. Introduce them slowly and say for the first time they might not like it, right? But then try it again in a couple days. Say, we're just going to take a no thank you bite. Let's just give it a whirl. But really looking at what foods they generate to texture wise, that's why they're picky, because of how it feels in their mouth. My daughter is a massively picky eater, but she goes for hard things. So if I gave her something soft, it most of the time is an immediate no thanks. So building that texture foods is important to look at. And if you want any more help on picky eating, you let me know. I'm more than happy to give you some suggestions and some references and kind of some like ideas on different foods. Also, getting them involved in cooking helps. Those picky eaters, they're going to be watching you cook, right? And then they're like, oh, well, I guess I want to try that, right? That's a really fun way of getting them involved. And then incorporating healthy eating habits and regular exercise. So maybe helping them decide what meal for the week they want to make, right? So those picky eaters, my daughter, I'm like, okay, well, what meal do you want to make this week? So she'll pick sometimes one that we'll make together, right? Or kind of thinking about, let's look at some of these cookbooks. What do you think you want to try? Right? So getting in some of those healthy habits. We live in a really fast-paced life. So if those kind of things are not easy for you guys to do, there's other ways to incorporate that, like helping them learn how to pack their lunch, right? Okay, well, my lunchbox comes home and is completely full. You didn't like anything I packed, right? So how about we look at those foods that you want to eat? And you already have them in the house. So that's another way of helping planning and prioritizing, time management, and also healthy eating. Okay, sleep. So I think I talked a lot about sleep, but having a really good, healthy sleep hygiene is important, especially for kiddos that struggle with ADHD. There are lots of different natural ways to help. A nice like shower or hot bath before bed, that if you're a family that likes to read like us, having that steady routine so they know what to expect. Their bodies are going to start to get tired. And then there's other times where having some soft, like meditative music in the back at night, making sure the lights are off. If they're scared of the dark, making sure the light is still like dim. You can get a red light so it still shines in the room, but it's not as bright. So it helps with those circadian rhythms. But they need a fair amount of sleep in order to help with that focus and emotional regulation. Okay, so this was about building resilience and advocacy. I just want to stress how amazing your kiddos are with the way that their brains work. And as much as it's probably challenging at times, I mean, I have 4 kids, and 2 of mine are a lot of work. And what I take from it is they make me a better mom. They've made me a better human, right? And when you think about your kids, they're here, they're a gift. And as much as it's hard, they are going to do something amazing. And it's just making sure that they have the supports and the community to help them see that, as well as to support you, because it's very tiring. It takes a village, right? So it's your school teachers, it's your social workers, it's your behavioral, your BCBAs, your OT therapists, your PTs, right? Your speech and language therapists. All of them together make a very strong team to support you, and they are resilient, and they will become very strong humans and do something amazing in the world. So just remember that tonight when you leave. Like, it's not doom and gloom. It's actually beautiful. You just haven't got to the roses and sunshine yet, right? You're still in the trenches. You will get there.